everybody. Thanks for joining. We'll get started here in a couple minutes. Still see people popping up. Wait until that levels off a little bit.
Maybe we should be playing some intro music.
You can fire up some intro music if you want to.
All right. You asked for it.
Here we are. After so much anticipation and drama, this is it. Two teams on the verge of...
All right, the first part of that was awesome.
Anyway, just helping folks out who need a sound check.
All right, I have within whenever I lead meetings, I have a hard rule that we start them at 2 minutes after. So we're 2 minutes in. Cool. All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm Tad Whitaker. I am an OWASP chapter lead in San Francisco. I live here in the Haight, and I am the head of security at Circle CI, where I've been for about 4 years. Welcome to Measuring Security. We're going to spend about the next 90 minutes or so having a panel discussion about how to measure security beyond compliance frameworks and patching cadence, basically. Wanted to kind of let everybody know a couple of things just to be aware of. Number one, please be respectful and polite. We will boot people out if a problem occurs. This meeting is being recorded, so just know that if you don't feel comfortable being recorded or having your face or your name up here, you should leave now. We will be posting this on the OWASP Bay Area YouTube channel. Leaf is in this meeting. He is another co-lead of the San Francisco OWASP chapter. He's going to be serving as our Zoom IT admin. He can mute people. He is the admin on here. He'll unmute people as needed. He will be paying attention to all the questions and the chat that's going on in the Zoom chat over here on the right. So if you have a question that comes up, please post it in there. Leith is going to be monitoring those, and he will be slacking me the most relevant ones. So if you're looking to get something in front of the panel, make sure you post it in there. Great. I think with that, I've kind of given an intro myself. I will turn it over to the other panelists here. Let me start with Rich.
Sure. Hi, I'm Richard Seiersen. I'm the CEO of Soluble. I'm also a serial recovering CISO and an author of a book called How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk, and the author of a book that's taken forever to get published called the Metrics Manifesto, Confronting Security with Data. And super pleased as punch to be here.
Caroline, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Caroline. I'm currently the Chief Strategy Officer at a pen test as a service company called Cobalt.io. As Chief Strategy Officer, I oversee our cybersecurity function as well as our human resources function, which is unusual, but interesting. And I actually find that there are some super interesting things that are in common with regards to security and HR, namely that you're trying to drive specific human behaviors. I started my security career 15 or so years ago at eBay and Zynga, and I authored a book called Security Metrics, A Beginner's Guide, which was published by McGraw-Hill in 2011.
Great. Charles?
Charles, you're on mute.
There it goes. Okay. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Charles Nwatu, and I'm currently an engineering manager at Netflix, building out a team called STAR. It focuses on security, technology assurance, and risk. We are trying to find ways to integrate risk measurement into informed decision-making. I started my career back in the DoD doing digital forensics and incident response. I had stops at different various Bay Area companies, had a chance to work with Richard before, have had great interactions with Caroline in the past. So I'm really looking forward to sharing knowledge, breaking bread, and definitely getting questions from our audience that they would like to hear us answer.
Great. The first, I've only got about 4 or 5 real prepared questions. Caroline had a couple and Rich had one he wanted to ask everybody, but I'll start with the first one on mine. I'm going to kind of go left to right in my Zoom gallery here just to keep kind of things orderly. Rich, and I'll make sure to kick this over to Charles and Caroline as well. Rich, based on where you currently work or where you have worked, what are some specific security measurements that you personally developed, reported up to management, and found useful that informed your decision making?
Sure. I'll give one tangible example for a company that I was doing some work for. And in this case, they were persisting what were billions of records of PII and S3 buckets. And fortunately enough, nothing ever happens with those, right? And they had, let's just say, a rather a questionable amount of cyber insurance in this case. I'm not selling books here, but using the models was able to look at what we understood about the state of risk, given into consideration the value that was at risk. Built a model within a few days that basically showed that we had a 20% chance of losing $20 million, 1 time more over a 3-year period, and recommended that we buy $20 million more in insurance at just over $100,000. Maybe I would have made that decision with or without the model, but the model gave me, helped me think really concretely about the decision I need to make as an executive, as a senior executive. And hey, I could have spent $100,000 and maybe hiring an intern, right? Or I could have spent it on getting what was $20 million more in insurance. And so I opted for the insurance. So that's an example of using metrics to inform an executive decision that actually took place. I have a lot more concrete ones when it comes to actually at the more practitioner level, but I just wanted to share that one. True story.
Let's hear the practitioner level one.
Sure. I started working for a company that was fairly far along. They were publicly traded, but they were relatively nascent in their security practices. In fact, all they had effectively was a bug bounty program in place. And the question was, how do we know whether or not we are actually getting any better or not at controlling security in development? This is a company that was doing tens of thousands of software releases a year. And so since we have someone from a bug bounty company, it wasn't your company, I said, okay, well, how do we know whether or not we're getting any better? So downloaded 18 months worth of data from the bug bounty company and was able to create a model that showed the rate, which it was really a day rate in terms of what would be exploitable risk, right? And was relatively low, but was able to show that over the last 2 quarters, there had been a 70% increase in what would be considered, exploitable risk. How do we know it's exploitable? We paid bug bounty, so it was mathematically unambiguous in terms of the outcome you're measuring. But we were able to determine that there was actually a marked increase at the rate with which we were paying out over a long period of time, which led to trying to understand what was actually going on in engineering that led to this. it was a relatively simple approach, being resourceful with the small amount of data that we have. We didn't throw up our hands and say, gosh, we don't have a huge program here. We don't have everything, inside the CI/CD. We don't have all the scanning going on. All we have is bug bounty. But can we use that small amount of data and be resourceful to determine whether or not our capabilities are improving or degrading? In this case, it was demonstrably obvious that things were heading in a wrong direction. So,
did you use the results of that? So so you proved a point, or you discovered something new with that, right?
Yeah.
So did you use that to justify and say, hey, you know what, we really need to beef up our application level security to, because we keep having OWASP top 10 bugs get through or anything like that? Like, what was that? What was the
yeah. Well, so what was happening historically?
Outcome there?
The outcome historically was when something bad would happen, there would be a meeting. We'd say, hey, here's bad vulnerability. All right. Then however many days, weeks would go on, then here's yet another bad vulnerability. Go fix, right? Go do this. But there wasn't any way to determine whether or not we were actually getting better in terms of our security capabilities. That's, as a CISO at least, that's the ultimate question I have is, are we getting better or worse, particularly when you're dealing with high velocity software development, right? With the ephemeral workloads and whatnot. Are the things that I'm investing in, or are the things we're doing actually making a change? And are we actually measurably, in a mathematically unambiguous and empirical manner, are we actually getting worse? If we only stay at bad thing, fix, bad thing, fix, bad thing, fix, we're not really developing, getting any better. What I used it for is a way to say, look, we need to invest more in security. In fact, we need to do it, and particularly in application security. And we need to do this now because things are actually getting demonstrably worse. And before we did that, we were just doing the same thing, bad thing, fix, without even observing whether or not we were improving. And I would just argue, I think this is probably the most important thing when it comes to for a CISO, when it comes to metrics, is being able to get data that lets you know whether or not you're actually improving or not. Are your capabilities degrading or not? And you don't need a lot of data to do that. You need to be resourceful. That's the most important thing.
Great. Well, thanks for all that.
Sure.
Caroline, you are next. So let me repeat the initial question. Based on where you currently work or where you have worked, what are some specific security measurements that you personally developed, reported up to management, and found useful to inform your decision making?
Okay, cool. So I have a few examples that I'd like to share, and they're from different parts of my career. The first is when I was on the global information security team at eBay, and I was the chief of staff for the team. At this point in time, our CISO, like many CISOs, was trying to get budget and money for the program. And the way that he did that was he used benchmark data. He is a well-networked person. He literally called up a dozen or so CISOs and he said, how much are they giving you this year? And he wrote that on a PowerPoint slide and he showed eBay's executives and they gave him a bunch of money. So that was thing number one. Thing number two that I'd like to share that I did not include in my intro is actually, so prior to joining Cobalt, I spent a few years at Cigital before Cigital became Synopsys. And one of my roles at Cigital was to be a BSIM lead. So for folks who may or may not be familiar, I'll actually type this into the chat, BSIM, BSIMM.com. Of course, autospell does not like that. But yeah, if you're not familiar with BSIM, check it out. It is a descriptive model of software security. What does that mean? So whereas many models that we use in security are prescriptive and say you should do A and B and C, the BSIM actually looks at a bunch of different organizations and the way that they do software security, and then they write down in a descriptive matter, what do they actually do? So beyond what sounds like a good idea, but what was actually a good enough idea for someone to actually have happen. So BSIM was used, I was just looking up, the most recent version of BSIM is BSIM 11. It contains data from 130 or so organizations. All of that data is free for anyone to download. Highly recommend that if you're not familiar, you consider taking a look. It's got something like 110 different application security activities that have been observed in the wild, if you will. And the reason that folks would pay, tens of thousands of dollars for us to come in, interview their folks and produce this report for them was because they were then able to say, well, here's how we compare to other folks, give us more money. More recently at Cobalt, so one of the things that we do is we do manual pen testing. And because we capture that data in a SaaS platform, we actually have data from more than 2,500 pen tests in this platform, which gives us a very cool ability. Richard, I'm gonna actually message you separately and ask if you're still doing consulting on the side, which I hope you are, because we've been able to do some of our own data analysis on this data set and provide that to the world. So for the past couple of years, we've produced most recently State of Pen Testing 2020, as well as State of Pen Testing 2019. I actually want to highlight State of Pen Testing 2019, during which we discovered misconfiguration was the top vulnerability category across all of the pen tests that we had conducted for 3 years. Spoiler alert, in 2020, it was the top again. And so what we did was we produced a 27-page report. It is available for free for anyone to download. And we said, here are the most common security misconfiguration issues that we see in our pen tests. And here's what you should be doing to think about them, to focus on them, to fix them. Finally, I said that there were some interesting things that were in common between my two parts of my job, between security and human resources. One of our super important HR metrics is what's called employee net promoter score. So you send out this survey and people say they rate on a scale of 1 to 10. I would recommend for my friends and family to work for this company, score it out of 1 to 10. And the security SNPS, security net promoter score, says, I'm confident that the security team at Cobalt is doing the right things at the right time. So those are a handful of things. Yeah, thanks for asking.
I never thought about that. So following up on that last point, how did people score? How did internal employees actually feel? Like, did they actually feel like the security team was doing a good job? And over what period of time did you measure that? And were you able to get that NPS score up?
Yeah, so I'm trying to unhide in this copy of our KPI spreadsheet, and I have hidden instead. So here we go. So our goal was to be at 80. It looks like we do it every 6 months. And over the past 3 times that we've conducted it, we've gone from 80 to 88 to 93, which is pretty solid. And that's something I'm really proud of. I should note actually that in addition to security net promoter score, we do a separate one that is percentage of employees passing security knowledge testing. So we don't just provide awareness and education material, we actually test our folks and say, okay, do you actually know your stuff? And we insist on a 95% pass rate across our company. And that's every single role, from engineer to, junior marketing associate.
That's really useful. Thanks for sharing all that. Okay, Charles, you're next up. Based on where you work at Netflix or somewhere else before that, what are the specific security measurements that you personally developed and that you reported up to management and that you found useful for informing your decision-making on things like hiring and tooling or staffing?
Well, I'll probably take a different perspective than my panelists. So coming out, I started in the DoD, working for a combatant command out in Europe. And at the time, there was this major initiative called HBSS, which was like a host-based security system. And as a civil servant, like one of our flyaway team, we sort of worked on how do we determine the efficacy of the host-based system itself? Like we had a combination of IDS and IPS rule sets. So what the team that I worked on, what we decided to do was basically strip all the rules down to the bare minimum and essentially go to a cyber range and literally test every single rule against toolkits that we knew were available And how would the DoD enterprise respond to those things? And how will we actually create the right alerting? How do we create the actual run books for each of those alerts? So what came out of that was the company vendor had their idea of high, medium, and low alerts. And then once we got through with our cyber range practices and actually doing the metrics of how effective were the rule sets and enhancing some of the rule sets, we came out with our variation of what high, medium, low was for the DoD enterprise. And that effort sort of helped shape how we staffed for alert and response, because one of the other things that happens, if anyone is familiar with the SOC experiences, death by alerts. So how do we ensure that the alerts that were being presented were actionable and allowed our analysts to actually do what was necessary for that particular triage event? So that I would say that's more from a tactical implementation of using metrics in terms of how do you prioritize what alerts benefit your particular enterprise. I didn't mention in my lead up, but I had a chance to lead security at a company called Stitch Fix. If most people, it's a clothing in a box type of subscription model. And one of the things that I started off there was, how do we measure our application security in regards to the amount of vulnerable code that existed in our CI/CD pipeline? And one of the efforts that we're starting there before I had a chance to actually see it through to completion was enumerating the code base, understanding all the different forms of libraries and their versions to understand, like, were we exposing ourselves for an exploit to happen because of the fact that we didn't understand the health of our code base? One of the things that I heard Richard and both Caroline say, like, that really resonates with me is that metrics is a form of understanding how things are operating. And I think once you get an idea of what is important for your business or what's important to you to sort of measure, it just allows you to make informed decisions. I think reduce your uncertainty in that decision-making process. And like one of the other things that I had a chance to do in my current role here at Netflix is we had a traditional ERM with a 3x3 graph of red, yellow, green quadrants. And so we doubled down into this methodology called FAIR, Factor Analysis of Information Risk, just to reorganize how we talked about risk in the business. And especially with senior leadership and executives was how do we reshape the conversation around risk, and how do we start talking about annualized loss expectancy of these particular areas over an event happening every 1 to 2 years. So we just, I think, took 3 quarters to finish that type of work, but that metric or that type of work has allowed us to say, hey, this particular portfolio of risk is increasing quarter over quarter. Are there projects in the pipeline that are actually addressing this risk? Is this risk comfortable for us? Like, it changes the nature of the conversation that we're having with leadership to focus on what type of investments should we be making in this space? Are we investing enough in this space? Do we need to pull back within this space? So I think like there's a question in our chat, like, how do we see eye to eye with security and leadership? I think part of it is that words matter, structure matters. Some form of like taxonomy in terms of how I can talk to you matters. And I think we're using risk as a way to sort of bring down that barrier to have those conversations and to align better.
Charles, I have a follow-up for you, actually. I'm so curious because we at one of my former organizations where I was on the security management team, we tried to use FAIR and we thought it was like a great idea. And we on the security team were super excited about it and got really into it. And then when we tried to show it to other people, all that happened was they just kept questioning our methodology. They just kept questioning, well, how did you come up with that number? And we were like, hey, between the, whatever it is, 5 of us, we have decades and decades of experience, we have, but we don't have, I don't have a particular data set that I can point you to for this stuff, And so I'm very curious to know, what was your experience like on that end? Did you have folks that bought in right away, or did you get any of that sort of pushback?
So we had a spectrum. We had people that bought in, were like, okay, yeah, we're down to do this. And we had people that asked the same questions. How did you get to this point? Basically, we had to show them under the hoods as to what we were doing. And part of, I think this is part of the challenges that I'm just seeing in general when I talk about risk measurement as a whole is like, there is almost a defensive nature in saying like, I don't want to admit or put down pen to paper what my subject matter expertise tells me about this space. And the experiences that I've seen with people with regards, they see risk as an audit. And it's not necessarily an audit. We are trying to use your subject matter expertise to help build models that allow us to increase our certainty, or at least decrease our uncertainty about this particular space or this particular field. So in order to do that, we had one-on-one conversations with team levels to really understand, to show them like what the process was. Like we actually walked through a fair assessment to get an idea, to show them exactly where their data and their insight helps us in the measurement process. Because we can use our own subject matter expertise, but we think it's better to have like the target group calibrated in a way that we can capture that and then leverage that for the data sets that we have. So it really was, once again, like, how do I decrease that barrier with like my partners at Netflix to basically say, like, this is not an audit. We're not trying to get you or gotcha, but we know you're making investments and work in this space. We need your help to capture that information in a way that we can apply that to show the actual benefits that the work that you're doing and how that reduces our potential loss exposure for a particular risk category.
Can I jump in on this a little bit?
Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, Netflix is a real leader in this space. I mean, I know Jason Chan was early on. I think he was the first security practitioner there, was using methods like this. I think for the audience, just one thing I'd say is, when we talk about risk measurement, in this case, you'll hear this term from me a lot. We're looking to measure, we're confronted with irreducible uncertainty. And that's just a fancy way of saying, look, we have to make a bet about something and we don't have an actuarial table, a long run history of data. In fact, all we have maybe are subject matter expert beliefs. And we may think, oh my gosh, measuring beliefs, that's really awful. Well, actuaries actually do that all the time. My book was required reading for the Society of Actuaries exam starting in 2018. So, I mean, listen, they're in the business of making bets. They're in the business of selling policy, and they're not going to let a lack of data stop them from doing that. So you have it on you can trust me that these are methods that are really becoming popular. But listen, when you have data, you should use methods that use data. And in fact, there is probably one of the most ancient methods of doing risk measurement is Bayesian methods. And Bayesian methods bring together both your subject matter expert beliefs as priors with data, particularly to handle the case when you have messy data, you have limited data, but yet you still have to make a bet. So in security, we're always making bets, right? And by the way, in security, it's always messy data. It's always the case. And so our job is to be as resourceful as possible. And if we have a real big, complex set of risks where we don't have the data, but we have to make a bet, like talking about cyber insurance or what's happening in Netflix, it's totally reasonable to use methods like FAIR or similar to the methods that we have in our book as well. So I just want to say, go Charles, and what he's talking about is like totally normal.
Well, Rich, I wish we could go back in time and you could tell the executives of this online video company that I worked for, that would have been so helpful.
Well, I'll say one last thing. I know I talked a lot. I've had the opportunity to present when GE was a company, I guess they're still a company, but to their board many times. And, Jeff Immelt, he had his undergraduate in applied maths from Dartmouth and a quantitative MBA from Harvard. And he was the dumb one in the room. They're full of physicists on the board. I never presented the quantitative output of my stuff. So I shared decisions, right? The methodologies were for me, right? Where I was unclear, where I still had to make a bet, I didn't have all the information, I used methods that Charles just talked about. But it was for me to help provide assurance where I had a lack of assurance as a CISO to go then present. I never presented the sausage factory. That would have been dangerous, right?
Great. I think we can move on to all that was very useful. I wrote down 5 bullet points of things that I'm going to follow up on my own tomorrow. The next question that I had, again, I'll kind of go left to right here, starting with Rich. What are some specific examples of things that you thought you should be measuring, but they turned out to be distracting and that you wound up discarding? Or what do you think are the most common eye candy things people measure but don't add a lot of value?
Sure, I'll give a practical example. This is about 10 years ago when I started getting into, started doing a lot of data science stuff, but started getting into, this is decision science and decision psychology, what we were just talking about, and was running an offensive security team amongst other things. And this is at a largest health maintenance organization in the United States. And I was responsible for operations across the US. And one of my groups was responsible for offensive testing. And we had a risk management methodology that would take results from those assessments and use them to start rank ordering what we should do. And it had things like in terms of when you're looking at a particular risk, like ease of exploit, right? That would be one. And then, availability of methods and other stuff like that. There are a lot of risk management or cybersecurity risk management approaches. I think even OWASP calculator is one of them. And what we started looking at was, I suspected that there was a problem here. And what we started finding out is that the 12 different factors that we were using to understand security risk, that of the 12 factors, only 2 of them actually had any information value. What do I mean by that? In terms of how I had a team of roughly 20 pen testers, how they were actually using this data to go about and take assessment results, use them to go make decisions about making changes to critical infrastructure. Like, this is as security as it gets. This is health maintenance sort of stuff, right? We found is that the methodology, that only 2 of the factors actually had any information value whatsoever. So the idea of being able to say, okay, we're going to measure ease of exploit, right, with necessary experience of a practitioner and other factors, that they actually were highly correlated and provided no information value whatsoever. I find this across the board with things like CVSS, perhaps the OWASP calculator, and even the CIS RAM, for example. All these methodologies have these factors that we think are important to measure that represent how we go about thinking about risk. And most of them have little to no value. I mean, when I say information value, you're wasting your time completely. And we were. This is a methodology that had been used over several hundred assessments. I took over the practice. We actually statistically measured the values, threw everything out, started all over again, and started producing consistent outcomes. Sorry, I kind of went off there. This is very important, though. A lot of the methodologies that are embedded both within our tools and methodologies that are coming from the federal government otherwise have low to no information value when it comes to actually making decisions about cybersecurity change. And so that company, that's what happened. And we were dealing with, it was as security as it gets.
That's great, thanks. Caroline, same question to you. What are some metrics that you focused on and used for a while, but then ultimately threw out because you realized they were a distraction and not actually contributing to improving the security of the org? Wait, did she just drop off? Looks like Caroline just dropped off, maybe. Charles, looks like you have your charger.
Yeah, I'm back.
All right, cool. I'll kick it over to you. So what are some specific examples of metrics that you developed and used for a while, but then ultimately rejected because they were a distraction and not actually helpful?
So I have to say, unfortunately, in my experience to date, I haven't really had the opportunity to find metrics that I didn't find valuable. And I take a step back because my approach has always been when I go into environments for the first time is like, what are my visibility metrics like across an organization? And I sort of bucket visibility from like endpoints, applications, infrastructure, SaaS, and then vendors. Like, how do I understand that? So I personally have tried to maybe stay away from those types of metrics. I think, Rich, you call them like the shiny things, but don't really say anything at the same time. I try to focus on things that will either inform decision-making or at least reduce my uncertainty about what to do next.
So let me ask kind of a follow-up question. So is that based on your experience at a very large organization, and how would that change if you were at, say, 1,000-person company?
Quite honestly, actually, I look at them the same. My core security philosophy is like do less better. Like if we're able to do the minimal things, like Caroline mentioned, like for 3 years in a row, misconfiguration is still number one. Well, we have, if misconfiguration is still number one, and we're talking about advanced capabilities of all these other like cool security whiz bang gadgets, but yet I can't instrument and have observability into the state of my laptop or into the state of my CI/CD pipeline or into the state of the third-party applications that I hook into from my code base. To me, it's very hard for me to make that leap from like, can we do the basics well to then doing to like advanced, well, maybe not even advanced, but that next order of security practitioner work. So I've always focused on like, hey, let's look at the basics. They may not be the most exciting thing, but they prove to be the foundation for which to build, I believe, all the next steps. And my personal belief in the security industry, sometimes we have an idea of, let's go look at the complex problems, yet there are very straightforward things right in front of us that if we just apply that same type of rigor, like we can solve these problems, whether it's a 1,000-person company or a 5,000-person company.
Great. Let me kick it over to Caroline. It looks like you're back.
Hi, thanks for your patience.
Don't worry about it.
I'm back. So we're talking about security metrics that maybe are not super good. So back in the day, I was on security teams that measured number of security incidents. And I even knew of people on the security team who on their performance review, it would say, like, if you didn't have a security incident, you would get your bonus. And if you did, then you wouldn't, which is like a super old school way of thinking, right? Because the reality, of course, which I think we generally accept at this point, is that security incidents are going to happen. They're happening right now. It's really just a matter of so many other things like detection, response, etc. So my thought on this is security incidents in of itself, less interesting than percentage of security incidents which are detected internally. Of course, contrasted with those detected externally, which is what we currently use. And that kind of tells us, do we need to dial up or do we need to dial down? I know I kind of took that question and I turned it into like,
no, I actually think that's important because based on my experience, I think that's accurate. I think it's easy to look and say, I think it's easy to have an executive say, okay, did we or didn't we have any security incidents over the last quarter? And to some degree, you could have 5, but if they were like legitimate anomalies, things happen. But I think if you have 2 of the same, like if you have 2 over the course of 1 quarter, but they were the same thing happening and they had happened from like the previous year as well, that's worse than having 5 anomaly incidents, I would say.
Could I jump in on that point?
Yeah.
Caroline, like I agree with that 100%. And the way that I think about it and the way that I'm seeing it used here at Netflix is that, you know, we do measure security incidents. And I think as we evolve, it's like the trending of that. Are we seeing a particular type of class, a particular group, or a particular vertical of where these incidents happen? Does that require us to change maybe how we do our integration with them or our training with them or our onboarding with them? Like to me, it's just a metric that allows us to, once again, determine the health of how people are operating within the enterprise or externally, if they're external actors that we have to do. So I look at those things as data points, once again, driving other decisions. Like I think incidents can be revealing about the current health and state of the overall security program, because they dictate to you like where the pain points are, or they could dictate to you where the pain points are.
Yep, I would actually love to respond back and say, and this is like not what we were going for, because before we started the panel, we kind of said, okay, we're going to challenge each other, but I can't help but agree. And specifically, I think that oh, now I feel silly because I've forgotten my point.
It's okay.
What were we talking about? This is what happens when my brain is like thinking at a different speed that my mouth is talking. What was just that last thing you were saying, Charles? I am so embarrassed.
Now you put me on the spot. Was
Yeah,
it
we
just
were
the
talking
overall?
about incidents. Oh, okay. You were saying incidents are super useful because they tell you where your problems are. And I totally agree with that. I do think that for very mature programs, and this is something that I learned when I was a BSIM lead at Cigital, having conducted more than 36 BSIM assessments for organizations, I found out that both incident response, the type of incidents, as well as penetration testing, folks were not using that so much as like a thing up front to say what's wrong, because if the place you're finding it out is in a pen test or in an incident, you're in trouble. But rather, folks were using this as like a process engineering improvement opportunity. So if we have a plan, if we have, a secure software development lifecycle with controls throughout that are intended to prevent these defects from being introduced or from being allowed to continue in the first place, then it's our incidents and it's our pen tests that actually tell us, okay, where did our process break down?
I think that goes back to something I recall Richard telling me when we were at our time at Twilio. It was around what would you need to see or observe that the outcome happened in a way that, Rich, I'm probably butchering it, so I'm probably going to need your help on.
What would you see occurring empirically, mathematically, unambiguously, that would let you know that X is actually working, whatever X is?
That's it.
Yeah. So yeah, on incident response, that is, to say, if you have an incident, shame on you. I'd say if you're not measuring, for example, your time to discover or time to respond, right? If you're not measuring those things, that would be where I might say shame. I don't want to shame anyone, but shame on us if we're not doing that, right? So in decomposing incident response, maybe looking at things like MITRE ATT&CK, whatever, that can get awfully fiddly, by the way. But getting some real tractable metrics where we can look at things like, let's even use responding to critical vulnerabilities. I think I mentioned that earlier, like the kind of things that escape out into the public domain that are flapping in the wind, going like the leaky S3 bucket, whatever. Are we measuring our time to discover that? Time to go back to misconfigurations? Are we measuring our time to detect things that haven't applied least privilege that are publicly exposed, right? Are we able to say we discover 50% of that class of P0, we discover those within 48 hours of instantiation? Let's say it's in Terraform, right? This is infrastructure as code, it gets spit out, and somehow it escapes through our process and is out there flapping in the wind. So all right, we're able to discover that this last quarter on average 48 hours. 10% of it was discovered in 2 weeks, and 1% gets discovered in a year. So we need to be able to measure those sorts of things in the curve and then invest in our capabilities to bring that curve down, right? But we get really specific about our ability to actually discover, respond, and do things. I think I don't hear enough about that in security. I'm sure people on this call are probably doing things like that. But those are the sorts of things where, from a capability perspective, I would want to be seeing a lot of more metrics stuff using, that was just survival analysis on a curve or engineering failure analysis, using methods like that to really start buying down risk, and really, particularly when it comes to incident response.
So I want to push you on that a little bit, Richard. You said time to discover. Like, unfortunately, I'm not sure I understand. How do you go about doing that type of work? Is it the fact? I'm gonna maybe use a simple example. Like for misconfigured S3 buckets, is it the fact that you have a capability that either on some cadence is scanning your infrastructure looking for the misconfigured? Is that what you mean by time to discover?
Yeah, we have to presuppose that there is, when you're going to do like time discovery, you have to presuppose that there's some line where you can say, okay, this is when the particular thing forensically or whatever first instantiated, that you had some sort of logs or some sort of thing where you could look back and say, okay, that's when that showed up. If you have no way to know when it discovered, then you can't use this measurement, right? You have another problem. By the way, that indicates that you have another problem. You have the capability problem.
Just a question from the group around that. How do you do that easily? Do you make engineers go through Git blame to see when the vulnerability was introduced in the first place? I feel like that would be met with resistance.
Ask the question again.
Yeah. So how do you actually do that easily and kind of go back and actually discover the time to discovery? Would you make engineers go back through Git blame, to actually see when a vulnerability was introduced in the first place or something like that?
No, I think you're going to make. I mean, you're going to the antibodies will come after you if you make them do that work. So you have to design. You have to have capabilities, and this is what a CISO in a cloud native environment has to do. You have to figure out, okay, I have a capability deficit here. I can't tell when bad things happen, wherever it might be. And it's like, oh, I've got to be able. That's a capability I need to figure out. And you talk to your vendors or what have you. But that's a capability problem. Once you have the capability in place to be able to discover when something instantiates, again, maybe it's like I'm talking about a Terraform commit. Maybe you have the hooks in the CI/CD. I don't know what you're doing from a security perspective, but you're able to see, okay, we can see that evil S3 leaky bucket instantiated on this date. And our capabilities were able to finally discover it and actually create a ticket that we qualified as a P0, right? That whole process of actually saying, oh, it's gone from some signal to now a thing. That's part of your security capability. 50% of those takes 2 days, whatever it is. 10% looks like it takes 2 months, and 1% takes a year, right? You're measuring now effectively. You're measuring on a curve, by the way. You want to measure on a curve because the bad guys attack at the end of the herd, right? It's the dangling precepts. The thing that's at the end is not being managed. You have to be able to measure that as well. So that's just what I'm stating, is that when it comes to measuring incident response capabilities, I think these are sorts of the things that, from a security perspective, we'd want to look into. Now, someone might say, "Hey, Rich, that's theoretical, right? Because no one's doing that." I'd say no. Everyone in the science measures of engineering failure analysis, time to event analysis, epidemiological survival analysis. That's how everyone else measures. It's not theoretical. That's how they do it. Doing it some other way would be theoretical.
Rich, I have another challenge question for you for fun, which is I agree that other folks are doing it, and I agree that it is the right way to do it. The question that I have for you, and frankly for our whole panel, as security practitioners, as security leaders, is how do you actually justify the investment that it requires to get that data? So not
measuring is more expensive than measuring.
Well, so I think that's super interesting. I think that that's a fair response. And I'd love to kind of continue this a bit because in my experience being in situations where I'm asking for security budget, if I'm asking for a person, then I may decide, oh, this person's going to work on application security activities. This person's going to work on compliance activities. This person's going to work on strategy and roadmap activities. Now, I've been in a very fortunate position where in a previous life, I had 3 full-time individuals working for me just on security metrics. And that was super cool. And we got to do some super cool stuff. But in a lot of cases, one of the things that we came to, we said, if we had this data, would we decide anything differently? And we thought if the decision is not going to be different, even if we had the data, then increasing the lever on precision and accuracy is not worth it to us.
Yeah. When you don't have uncertainty, when you're not dealing with uncertainty, then why measure? If I already know I can fit through that door, I don't need to measure to say, well, I fit through that door. We measure when we have uncertainty, right? And where we need to reduce that uncertainty. If the cost, though, of getting information outweighs the value, the return on investment, then we don't want to do that. But certainly, I think security security is a measurement game in many ways. Science is. I mean, you wouldn't have science without measurement. We wouldn't have sports without measurement either. You wouldn't know who won.
Rich, we live in a world where science is questioned. That's kind of a half joke. That's a half.
Well, no, that's a good. I mean, I love that joke. We measure because of our uncertainty, not in spite of it, right? Sorry, I want to get overly philosophical. I haven't even had a drink yet. So.
But even if we tease that out a little bit, like Caroline, as you were mentioning, you have a person that does application, you have a person that does GRC, but do we as practitioners actually think about how do you go about establishing metrics as a way to inform how would you build out a security team? Like there's a default, I would say, I have a default nature that, oh, I know I'm going to go build an AppSec team. I'm going to need a digital response team. I'm going to need someone to do infrastructure security. Like it's almost ingrained that that's how security is supposed to work. what if someone approaching differently and say, no, I want to do it from a quantitative standpoint and be able to measure the uncertainty about this particular business that I'm trying to do security in. I, for one, have never been in a place that started from that vantage point, but I know in my current role, we are at least exploring options to, for instance, in our application security, we have defined like 10 security feature sets, and we are measuring the efficacy of these feature sets for two reasons. One, to help inform our engineering population that, hey, if you have a limited amount of time, what is the thing that you can do that causes the biggest impact in a positive way? We want to help surface that, as Richard would say, like, I want to reduce your uncertainty there and say, like, this is the thing you should be doing. And we're trying that model with our AppSec investment. And then also on our endpoint side, we have Stethoscope. It's an open source tool. We're also exploring options where if I'm trying to tell an end user, like, what is the most important thing about security that they should do at this point in time, how do I measure that in a way and provide the risk in a way that the user will know? It's like, hey, I got 5 minutes. You know what today I'm going to do? I'm going to go clean up my public access folders on Google Drive, like, because I'm informed enough to make that appropriate decision. I also think there's a psychological human behavior element around how to receive risk metrics and how to actually use security metrics from a consumer standpoint, in addition to how do you develop those metrics in the beginning.
So there's someone who does this actually, and her name is Larkin Ryder, and she has been the acting CISO at Slack. What I mean by she does this is she applies a scientific method to what I think a lot of us hold as folks who've like simply been doing this for a long time, as like, this is what you do. And one of the things that I think is really cool about the way that Larkin runs her security program, and she's also specialized in product security, is she applies this scientific method, which is to say, she comes up with hypotheses, she measures them with data, and then she sees what's true. She did do this on bug bounty programs at Slack, which I thought was super interesting. She started talking about this when I was interviewing her for Humans of InfoSec, and I thought to myself, gosh, Larkin, I work for a pen test company. I don't want you talking too much about bug bounty, but then it actually kind of turned around in my favor. She had done an experiment, and she talks about this on the podcast, where they were measuring the impact of increasing bounty payouts. And they found that it was not as expected, which they wouldn't have known if they had not bothered to measure it. Richard, to your point.
What was the expected behavior and what was the actual behavior there?
So the hope and the desire, if you will, was that if you increased bounty payouts, you were going to get more severe, more interesting vulnerabilities. What actually happened was you got a lot more low quality incoming reports. And even on the podcast, I make this silly reference to a Netflix show, Charles. So there's this great show. I think it's great because the way that I measure shows is by their entertainment value. So it's called Dead to Me. Many folks may not think this is a great show. I think it's a great show because it allows me to have fun and escape. In Dead to Me, there is a murder mystery, and there is a conversation that takes place in the detective's office, and they're trying to decide if they should offer a reward for any tips about what happened with regards to this murder. And they end up deciding not to, because otherwise, I think the phrasing was something like, all the crazies are going to come out because everyone wants that money. So they're gonna submit, what, bringing us back to the security world, would be the equivalent of an invalid bug report or a low quality bug report, because there is this big human psychology and motivation piece that plays into a lot of these different experiments that we conduct. And so in that case, the story that she shared with me was that unfortunately they did not seem to increase their criticality and interesting levelness of vulns, but they just got a ton of crappy, useless reports, which created a bunch of manual work for them to do.
Great. I think let's actually use that as a segue to the first question, Caroline, that you had. You want to go ahead and ask that?
Cool. So Rich and Charles, why is it so hard for security leaders to die? And for the sake of a little bit like edgy, in a sense, is it just that company executives are really dumb and they just don't get it?
You were breaking up there a little bit.
Oops. Okay, I will say that again. Why is it that security leaders and executives have trouble seeing eye to eye?
Oh, well, because security is a cost center. It's expensive. We're dealing with dealing with mitigating probable future loss, and so it's like it's like death. It's like dying of a heart attack. I mean, the major symptom of a heart attack is actually death. It's not other symptoms. So it's one of those things where it's hard because I'm going to take money away from product. I'm going to take money away from getting things out that customers are going to buy, and it can become very hard to justify. So I think that's one of them. And then security act, particularly in modern companies, when you act like a cop, and I've learned this the hard way, by the way. So I'm not saying I'm good. I've learned through doing it wrong. When you act like a cop, right, you're also going to have issues as well. You have these product managers and CTOs who, their job is to, satisfy the business requirements. And developers, they want to get their stuff, they want to build new stuff. And you're coming in and, in theory, if you're taking a cop-like view, say, hey, I know, let's put a boulder in the way, or let's put a boat anchor here, and make things less fun. So you have multiple ways to just create conflict for yourself. So I'm here to say, by experience, don't do that.
I would say from my experience, there's once again a spectrum. I can remember a time at Twilio working with Ari and team over there, where we started thinking about like security as a cost center, as Richard mentioned. But we were getting asked to be performing all these third-party assessments to enable the business to do more partnerships and integrations. And then we sort of flipped that and said like, well, we're enabling business. Like our security assessments are allowing for these, are a component of the decision to be made to work with these vendors. Now, sometimes the ordering was out of step, but the company recognized that there was some relationship in terms of having security perform some type of work in terms of a third-party assessor of a vendor. So that was one way in terms of how do you shift some of that conversation around like that seeing eye to eye at that level. And if I go back to what I mentioned before, words matter, framing matters. There is a journey for which, like going what Richard said, I think Caroline, you mentioned this in your question, like if CEOs are dumb and everything else, like are we just at odds with each other, right? I truly believe that part of the security practitioner role is to bring people on this journey, and it's imperative for us to understand how to communicate and use the right, whether it's code, framing, language, to help people see that. Because when people talk about P&L and finance, people understand that, and some people don't have no finance background. But when we talk about security at times, it can be such a loaded language that it can create attention, it can create intimidation, and it can create a barrier where communication dies. It's not as structured. It doesn't have as much value. At the end of the day, I look at that relationship, like when I was the head of a security at Stitch Fix, is like, how do I improve my ability to communicate with my partners so that I understand where they're coming from to relay the information I need? Like Richard said, it's challenging. Like it can be challenging. I don't want to put boulders in front of people. I do want to act as a partner and guide, but at the same time, I'm not trying to let people walk over me too.
Yep. So that's a great segue, Charles, to my follow-up question, which is, so what do you do? How do you learn, right? I have a theory that the only reason security matters is because we're trying to protect stuff that's valuable. And if we as security practitioners don't understand the value creation at our organizations, then we're actually not doing our jobs. But Charles and Rich, what are your thoughts on what's your advice for security leaders to approach executives in a way that might be more effective?
Richard.
Oh, well, yeah, again, I've having lived at the bottom of the salt mine, banging rocks together, and have done it well and done it really poorly. I think, at least where I did it well, and actually now we co-founded a company together. I went to the DevOps leader who ran all of the, all the CI/CD, ran all of the cloud, had all really the power, had the leverage. And I needed to understand how he and his team worked, because I really needed to insert what I was doing inside of their environment. This is my last CISO gig. And so I felt honestly, it was really important to me to get to know this person, to know his team and what was their focus, what was keeping them up at night, and how do I then partner with them to really get done what we needed to get done, right? So really understand the terrain, because again, they were inserted in the place where because I want to do security the DevOps way. I had to, there's no other, couldn't do it the old way, right? So I think one of the things is, find out who in the organization really does have the leverage. They probably have the leverage for a reason. If you understand particularly from an infrastructure perspective, your security, right, and AppSec, if you can get to, understand what it's like to live in their shoes, you'll be in a much better place to have a conversation that's constructive. I wish I'd known that like even 3 or 4 years ago, but that I think that's critically important. And it worked. I think it worked for me because we left and started a company together. So I don't know if that's success or failure yet. Ask me in about 5 years, but yeah.
I have a philosophy on that that's based in my previous life when I studied journalism and I was a newspaper reporter. And one of the truisms around being a reporter is all news is local news. And I think one of the most effective talking points to when you're talking to an executive and saying, okay, we really need to increase the pen testing budget, or we really need to invest in this back-end service to fix this thing. I know it's not a product delivery that you can sell someone, but again, in terms of I always try and localize the issue and try and relate it to something that has already happened, that was right in their face, that they hated. Where you could walk and you could say, okay, remember that one incident that we had 18 months ago, or that one big customer report that came in where so-and-so threatened to churn and it was an all hands on deck. We had to fix that thing. Like, we all hated that. And I don't think we don't have that problem anymore. This thing in front of us is eerily similar because of the following. And I think it's at that point where they can sit there and they can feel that viscerally, like, oh my gosh, a 6-figure customer was about ready to churn. I definitely don't want that to happen. And I think if you can pitch it like a newspaper reporter to them in a way that really ties it with like a good anecdote and relate it, then it becomes hard for them to say no.
I think Ted has touched on something, and something that has probably come to illuminate in my mind in the last couple of days is the art of storytelling. And from my experience, I remember doing a presentation where I'm just spitting facts like, hey, we got 57 vulnerabilities across our app, like boom, 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 boom. But there was nothing tying the emotional pull as a human being to understand, okay, like I know what loss means. Like I understand what the pain of that felt like. I don't want to revisit that. So how do I set that up for this thing? Like, I think there's something around how do we tell the narrative and stories of this work as a way to bring people closer to us. They don't need to be subject matter experts, but if we can bring them closer to understanding or help them connect those dots through the way we articulate and narrate our stories in this space, I think that's how you sort of decrease the gap there, Caroline. Just get it a little bit smaller. Like, I don't expect it to be perfect, but the more work we do in terms of our framing, we can just bring it that much closer.
Cool. Thank you all so much for indulging me in that deep dive. Next, I'd like to pass it to Rich, who has some questions for us.
I think the question that I had, I hope you guys don't mind if I go off script a little bit. The question I have, I think we've already touched on, and so I don't want to bore people to death. I have another question, and maybe it starts with Charles, and maybe even Tad will want to jump in on this just because of the nature of where you work right now, and maybe you, Carolyn, as well. We'll see. So Netflix is a big proponent of freedom and responsibility, and that's a cultural thing. It really started out though in software, because I think similar to even Twilio, you see small teams, right? You have small 2-pizza teams. They're responsible for a set of services, and the reality is that those teams have a lot of ownership. They carry a pager, as it were, if things go bad. And so we're really seeing, what we're seeing over time, though, what's creating that for everybody is that you're seeing the developer being able to, not just making, applications, they're declaring infrastructure. You're seeing the freedom and the responsibility really is shifting into the team, shifting into these distributed teams, shifting to the developer. Operations is really morphing. I'll lump security in with that as well. Again, a lot of power, responsibility, freedom shift to the developer. And the question I have for you is, how are you and so we're totally, by the way, in that we're totally outgunned, right? You developers, you're what, for 100 to 1 in comparison. The question I have for you is, how are you measurably, with a small team, small set of resources, how are you getting in front of this risk? Because I think it's an exponentiation of attack surface. This is a function of cloud native security or cloud native development in combination with a movement of shift left, more power to the developer. How are you measurably getting in front of this? Because companies are going from what they're doing 100 releases to thousands to tens of thousands of releases now a year. We're not growing in money. We're not growing in size. I don't think we're necessarily growing in skill sets either. So how are we getting in front of that? So that makes sense. I'll just boop, throw that over to you and you just play jazz with that.
I would say the one thing that I think about, and I think what I've seen here at Netflix, is the concept of like the leverage point. And really, we have security engineers that develop solutions that get leveraged by the business. So while developers are developing, like our goal is to put the tools in their pathway so that they just connect with it. I think the analogy we use is like, hey, if you want to scale the mountain, yeah, we'll let you scale, but there are some routes that if you go, it's going to be catastrophic to your life. Like we want to make sure we provide the insulation around that, the guardrails, so that, okay, you can go as fast as you want, but if you get close to here, we're probably just going to push you to the other side to protect yourself. And that comes with, I think part of it is like building services that are just consumed by the natural progression of the development cycles that we're seeing. Like being ahead of that, I think, is just understanding like what the developers need, what the infrastructure is growing into, and then literally just building solutions into that model to accommodate that and sort of get in front of that. That's one way of thinking about it. Yeah, the paved road concepts. The paved roads, like if you want to walk on this road, it's smooth, it's flat, it's been paved for you, you get to run fast, but you have the freedom to go off-road. No one's saying you can't go off-road, but understand by going off-road, you could pop a tire, you could get stuck, you may not get help as fast, but if you use this beautiful paved 4-lane highway here, you get to go fast.
Here at Circle, the security team is branded within the engineering department and in the company as a whole as an enablement team. We're not an enforcement team. We're not even a problem-solving team, I would actually say. We're working toward what Charles is talking about, a paved path to kind of provide a safe way forward so that people can focus on their jobs and delivering what they were hired to do, not solve something tangential. So like no developer should have to deal with encryption. Like how do I do this? Like honestly, that should just be something that you go and you pick up off the shelf. You know that it's FIPS validated. It's not going to blow up our audits next year or whatever. Like this is just what everybody is supposed to use because we put a lot of thought into it and it's standard. So I think there's that aspect. There's also another really big thing that I think I've learned over 4 years being, from the first security person to, now managing it, which is I don't think it's really any single person's job to solve a threat or to solve a risk or to take care of a specific risk. I think like Rich, you were talking about, shifting left and shifting responsibility. And I think one of the things that's important is that you don't shift responsibility left and into the hands of individual contributors in a way where it's easier for them to shoot themselves in the foot with a tool or or access to something. I think, anytime I see any incident that involves an employee, the very first question I have is not who did this, but did we as a company set this person up to fail here? Was this an organizational failing? And often it usually is, I would say. That's definitely, I would say, one of the big things. But then again, it's not even my team's responsibility to fix that right now, because we maintain a very big and active backlog, I would say. If something happens and we say, okay, this happened over here, it caused an incident, is it more important to the C-suite people that we fix this thing, or do we, or should we carry on with these other things that were a priority? And I think by having broad agreement on, yes, we should actually ignore our backlog and focus on this, then it becomes a group consensus that this is the best thing that we should be doing with our time and effort to help employees.
So I do have a thought that I'd really like to share, which is when I was at eBay, the approach that we took was to try and get ahead of it by having this talk, and then by engaging sort of the folks who were in the world. So what I mean by that was, at the time, for eBay, we had our CISO talk to our vice president of engineering and say, look, can we agree that we want our customer facing apps to have fewer security vulnerabilities? That's something everyone can get on the same page with. Then we decided to talk to the developers and say, okay, well, what realistic cycles do you have to address these security issues? And they told us, and we said, okay, over the next calendar year, we're going to look to jointly make a 20% reduction in vulnerabilities by thousands of millions of. Now, I think the number is super interesting because first reduction, not purity.
Is it just me, or is Carolyn breaking up?
I think she's breaking up.
Okay. Is the audio?
Someone's streaming Netflix at your home at the same time. That's what's going on.
That's definitely actually happening. Rich, I'm sorry, everyone. I'll try again with. Oh, yeah.
Let's come back to Caroline in just a minute. As soon as she thinks she's kind of got that sorted out. I've actually got we've got 17 minutes left in our time here, and I want to be able to take a couple questions from our audience participants. The first one that we flagged here is, and I'll start left to right again. Rich, if you had to choose 3 to 5 KPIs or metrics to report on the overall health of your SaaS company security program, what would they be?
Wow, that's a really great question. So I'm going to answer it in a way that may or may not be very satisfying for whoever asked that. The first metric I'd want to know is my risk management, what I call risk management efficiency, which is really your burn down of risk over your burn up of risk. So basically, this is real simple. You can be things in a ticketing system that someone mentioned backlog. I think, Tad, that was you. So you have things that go on in the backlog and things that are popping off the backlog, right? And those can be tiered based on priority, P0, P1, or however you do it. You'll have your own way of doing it. But I want to know an ongoing measurement of ratio of the things that are popping on top, your numerator, things popping off over things popping on. So the reality is, if it's P0 risk that's getting put in the backlog, maybe P0 never gets put in the backlog, maybe that's break the glass, whatever it is, you want to be heading ideally towards maybe a 85–90% efficiency rate. It'll be hard, but you want to be heading towards a KPI where you say, okay, this quarter, we're going to go from this ratio, this rate, to this rate, because this is a critical, maybe it's P1s for externally facing, blah, 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 whatever it is. Decompose it to something that really, really matters. So I want some sort of risk management efficiency rate, which has to do with our ability to efficiently burn down risk. And you want to be able to track that over time, right? So that's one. The next thing that I'd really want, so that's one area, and you can have N KPIs that flow off of that. The next thing that I would really want to measure is going back to what I just talked about, which is really call it time to live or survival analysis metrics. I would want to be looking at a set of KPIs in that, where I'd want to look, for example, let's go back to, and it can be correlated by way to this risk. We talked about the burn down of risk. So we can look at, let's say, publicly facing again. We'll just stick with the hot topic, right? Things are flapping in the wind. Maybe it's Elasticsearch or whatever hot topic that's in the news. But I would want to look at what is the time to live for critical exploitable risk. What is our time to live, right? And so again, that's P0, P1, where it is. And I want to be able to measure that. And I want to be able to set some KPIs to burn it down. But you have to baseline that first. So we would, for example, measure it and say, okay, well, 50% of critical exploitable risk, or whatever you choose, lives for N days or longer. Let's say it lives for 10 days or longer before it's mitigated or remediated or whatever. 10%, so that's 50% on average. 10% lives for 2 months or longer, and 1% lives for 400 days or longer. So you have a curve now, and you're measuring that over time. You should be able to set some KPIs on that where you say, okay, by this time, 2 quarters from now, we're going to buy down that curve. We're going to implement certain practices to bring that down to a new ratio. Again, by the way, everything I'm mentioning is empirical, mathematically unambiguous, and auditable. Okay, so that's really important. So I'm not going to bore you anymore. I'll put a link. I'm not selling anything here. I'll put a link to an article I wrote on this topic if you're interested. But I would have a set of measures that are like this, that are very SecOps oriented, very operational, that are, again, I can get into more of it. I don't want to bore you to death, but those would be the kind of things I'd be looking to do to target capabilities that are measurable.
Great.
So that might have been very unsatisfactory. I do that.
I think that was pretty helpful. Charles, 3 to 5 KPIs for a cloud-based SaaS company.
I was actually thinking of this question in a different way. I thought they were asking, like, what are the KPIs you would need from like SaaS vendors that you're using, not as a SaaS company itself. So actually, I don't really have any off the top of my head that I would call KPIs I would like to measure, to be quite honest.
So go with what you were asking, or what kind of where you were going. I know Netflix is maybe not the optimal model there, in a frame of reference for you, but
yeah. The way I was thinking about it was like, in this day and age, we all are using some form of a SaaS vendor. How do I know who I'm working with? Like, there's a visibility question, so that's a metric I would like to track. If you have the luxury and you understand your data elements and your data lifecycle management, do you understand what data is flowing to those particular SaaS vendors? So I would like to have an understanding of the different, whether you have them ranked as tiers, high, medium, low, like whatever your data archetypes are and how you've classified that. I would like to understand which vendors have that percentage of data and what is the type of SLAs you have with them. Because one of the challenges I see moving forward is, if we look at data as currency, well, if you don't know where your data is, that means you're losing money, or you have the potential to lose money. So I'm always following the data. And if the data tells me that it's leaving through multiple SaaS vendors, then that means part of my measurement has to be around the visibility, the observability, and understanding of that data as it leaves my infrastructure to other SaaS infrastructures. So that's what I was primarily thinking, because I would posit this question to anyone. How many SaaS vendors are you working with? Do you know if you're still paying them, or have you stopped paying them? And have you developed a data deletion policy? And can you actually enumerate whether or not that they're actually deleted your data? Like, they're just basic questions, but in the world that we're living in now, with data being currency, it's just the way that I think about like metrics around that space.
Great, thanks. Caroline, I see you're back. I'm not sure if you heard the question, but let me repeat it just in case. It was, if you had to choose 3 to 5 KPIs or metrics to report on the overall health of your SaaS company security program, what would they be? I'm muted.
And now I'm actually muted. And thanks everyone for your patience with me. I know it can be super annoying to listen to someone speak over Zoom when their internet is not working great. So I shared 2, which was security NPS, Net Promoter Score. Actually, I shared 3. Security NPS, Net Promoter Score, percentage employees passing security knowledge testing, percentage of incidents detected internally, and then depending on the stage of maturity for this particular SaaS company, maybe there are relevant compliance things, whether that be SOC 2, ISO 27001, and one I think is that's good is a percentage readiness.
What does percentage readiness mean?
So I feel like you can, I'm not an expert in this, but I feel like you can go out and look at various GRC tools and they'll say, you know, what security activities are you doing? And we'll match that to these various compliance regimes, and it'll like spit out a percentage. So I'm fairly sure that we just go into, what is ours? We use one called Tugboat Logic, but I think, you know, you could probably do this with like a Zen GRC. You know, there's a lot of options on the market for how you do GRC at different size and different maturity businesses. But percentage readiness for whatever, you know, pick your framework, pick your compliance thing that customers are asking for. That's another one.
Great. Next question from the audience. How do you measure the success or impact of non-automatable cultural or human practices, like the adoption of threat modeling?
Well, what would you see occurring specifically, mathematically, unambiguously, that would let you know that it's working? This is Francis Kettering. You know what is well stated and well formed is going to be well measured. He said something like that. So the question I'd revert this back to you, and I'd say, what would you see occurring again that you could empirically measure in terms of on and offs or counting things that would let you know that threat modeling is actually working? And I'd always work backwards from that. And by the way, I'm happy to talk about that offline.
Can you restate that?
Sure. So let me ask this: what would I see occurring specifically that would let me know that threat modeling is actually working? If that's what we're really getting into here. We're talking about how happy people are about threat modeling. That's a completely different subject. And I don't know, buy them burritos, I'm not sure, but you still need to threat model.
So I have a thought on the sort of subjective soft thing, which is to say that I think there's a lot of value to unsolicited third-party feedback. What do people say about your threat modeling program when you're not the one asking, or when they're not asking in front of your boss or their boss? What is the word on the street about how threat modeling is going? Are people, you know, spontaneously saying, wow, that threat modeling is super cool, we love it, you know, we've learned so much? Or are people saying, gosh, you know, I really feel like that was a waste of our time, you know, why did we even have to sit in that session at all? So I think that unsolicited third-party feedback can be super interesting when it comes to these sort of like human behavior activity things.
Charles?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to be spicy here. Like, I'm not sure what you will see at times, because how do you establish the baseline for what you're doing a project for, and then doing the like almost an A/B test on, like, we're doing, let's say, authentication rate limiting, and maybe we did a threat model to understand all the ways that it can happen, and the other side we didn't do nothing. Like I'm thinking in my mind, literally, I'm like, well, like, does it really matter? I'm literally asking myself, like, does it really matter to perform a threat model? I don't know, because right now there's like in my head, it's like, what data would I see that would push me to say, hey, we need to do something different here? I know security practitioners will say, hey, there's, of course, like rate limiting and DDoS protection. Like there's a checklist of things that you can do. But the question is, what is the right thing to do for your environment, for your data set? And I think, once again, measuring and doing that trade-off, like that's what I'm thinking about more than versus the threat model, the activity of the threat model itself. And I don't know how to overcome that, but I do have to say, whoever asked that question, that really got me thinking about, well, how would you articulate the value, and how would, as Rich would say, what would I have to see to actually know that this thing is actually happening and going on? Like I am sitting here saying, well, would it be a decrease in security incidents from this particular type of application or this particular type of team? Maybe this team has demonstrated like, I don't want to say failures, but yeah, probably failures in this space where have resulted in outcomes that were incidents. Like I don't know what would be the metric you would capture to demonstrate the value of the threat modeling. Not saying threat models are not great, but I think it's another tool in the security tool belt, and understanding why you're using it and how you're trying to get the data out of it.
Great. We've got 3.5 minutes left here, and I want to make sure that we're respectful of everybody's time. Wanted to kind of go along again, left to right, or maybe, I'll go right to left this time for some closing remarks, and just anything that maybe, like, what was the most useful thing that you learned here today? Let's start with Charles.
It's, I don't know, I'm going to assume a little bit, but to me, it feels like this space is still maturing and growing. And it's exciting to hear other people wanting to get into this space and how to actually leverage metrics. I think as an industry, we have ways to go, but I'm just excited to hear, like, to have a conversation in this manner where at least it's not as much theoretical. Like we did provide some examples. We are feeling pain points. How do you get other people to be involved? Like all the things, like the pains of growing this type of space out, like it's happening now. And I'm just really interested in seeing, like, what's next and who's going to solve this, because I've seen a lot of risk programs start and I've seen a lot of them die. So I'm holding my breath, trying to make sure I'm in the growth and survival mode versus the dying mode. So I'm really looking forward to partnering with people in this space here and learning from you all.
Awesome. Caroline.
So something that I think about a lot is the OWASP top 10. I am a LinkedIn Learning instructor for the Master the OWASP Top 10 course on LinkedIn Learning. And one of the things that I think about a lot is, if we look at the most recent version, which came out, there were 2 versions that were published in 2017, and we compare that to what came out in the initial version in 2003, they're not dramatically different. And so to me, what that says actually is that in the last 14 years, and next year, there's going to be another one coming out, right? What that says to me is that in 14 years, we as technical security practitioners, we actually have solutions to many of the technical problems that exist, many of the most common technical problems. But I think that when I ask the question, well, why has LIST not fundamentally changed in 14 years? I think the reason is because the complexity actually lies in the people and the process, less so than the technology. And that, I think, is something that as security leaders, that's something we're all trying to figure out. How do I be a person around these other people and understand what these people are trying to accomplish, and then try to influence them to accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish, and to Rich's point, there's always going to be way more developers than security people. How do you deal with that? I do think that people and process is a fascinating area of security. And I actually think that we know more than we think we know when it comes to technically solving problems, but that we have a lot of room to learn when it comes to solving the people and process parts of it.
Great, thanks. Rich, you want to close this out here?
Sure. A couple of things. I think this is just great that this is such a big conversation, and that we're seeing a lot of interest in, call it, quantitative the quantitative menagerie. You know, for a practice to emerge as a field, it has to go through the gateway of measurement. If you look at anything serious in the world, this is just the way it is. For something to become a real engineering discipline, it is not going to happen unless you go through the gateway of measurement. I think security is on the precipice of going from practice to an actual field of endeavor. And so to see so many people invest in this conversation, I think it's great. It means it's becoming serious. And what I'll close out in saying is, if anyone's interested in having a deeper conversation about this, I'm trying as hard to both, you know, deal with the startup as a CEO and finish my next book. By the way, note to self or to yourselves, don't take an advance from your publisher on a book that at the same time that you get money from a venture capitalist. I'm here to say, having done this, don't do that, because it'll take a long time to get something, you know, to get your book done, because the book will lose in comparison to the other. But if these topics are things that you've thought a lot on, or you want to think more on, I'm very open to having conversations. It helps me a lot. And so again, here, I'll put my email here. I hope that's okay. I don't know if that's politically incorrect, but if you want to talk about this, I'm happy to talk further.
I think that's a great idea. I think that's generous, Rich.
Okay. If you want to complain to me about my book, you can do that too. I can,
so that was actually the impetus for this whole talk. I tried for 6 months to really dig deeply into Rich's book, and I tried, and I was like, I'm not getting this, and finally, like on a Friday night, I was like, is that guy on LinkedIn? And here we are.
Yeah. So yeah, for those of you who bought the book,
response.
Yeah, for those of you who bought the book, I'll just tell you, starting at page 100, it's really good for pressing flowers. So, you know, you heard that from me.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Rich, Caroline, and Charles. Thank you very much. I think we should all give a little round of applause to Leaf for being the IT Zoom admin, Mike dude. And lastly, thank you very much for everybody who participated in the audience. And I think I kept seeing the chat was just scrolling by. It was awesome. I'm actually going to download that and kind of condense some of that and maybe throw it up on my blog or whatever, so we can actually kind of really get some of that out. But thank you very much for spending your evening with us. Sincerely appreciate it. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks for hosting us, Tad.
Yes, thanks.